Hello, everyone. I'm Riley Finnigan from Queen UB. I'm a first-year PhD student. I'm a self-described cyberarchaeologist, but I don't know if Maurizio Forte would agree with that. Today, I'm going to go over cyborg ontology, contemporary archaeology, how I believe that digital spaces provide archaeological value that is important to us in our archaeological record. So let's just jump straight into it. Archaeology and archaeologists work within a digital paradigm. We excavate, we communicate in part through digital processes, whether that be through, email, LiDAR, GIS, even just, taking a photograph record of a site, whenever you do anything. Um, and that sort of digital paradigm has given rise to various sub-disciplines within the field. And one of my favorites is cyberarchaeology. What it does is it takes different data sets from the whatever site you're excavating and sort of imposes them on top of each other to create these sort of interactive spaces that can be reconstructed and deconstructed front to back and back to front. So, for example, Maurizio Forte and his team excavated Çatalhöyük in Turkey. They used a cyberarchaeological approach. They had their own software studio for it. You can see a diagram on the right. This is one of the buildings from that. What you're looking at there is the GIS layers superimposed on top of their 3D model that they put together with different artifactual data they collected. And the reason the different zones are highlighted in different colors is because they're different data sets. And what the team was able to do was take individual data sets away to sort of create like a multi-temporal look at the site. They could establish different chronologies and things like that through this sort of
I
simulated
think it's just past 5 o'clock.
see those data sets that are overlaid and simulated. And that's brilliant. It's great. But there's a bit of digital blindness in these sorts of approaches. We are using the digital to investigate the physical, but we're not investigating the digital in the way I think we should. Now, there's a caveat to that, of course. Archaeogaming, as Louise just went over, there are digital approaches that look at the archaeology in and of video games, whether that is the hardware components like my computer or my mouse or the software, which is the actual game world itself. Most importantly, though, it also looks at the human element, and I'll come back to that later on. But before we get into it, these digital spaces, they're not real, okay? We can't physically live in them. We can't walk into them. We can't, hang out in them, so to speak, as ourselves. Um, they are what is called a hyperreal space. Now, hyperrealism was developed by a guy called Baudrillard. He's a French philosopher. He was writing before the internet existed. So his concept is to do with the way we represent things and ideas through, text, images, words, language, and so on. And what he essentially says is that overrepresentation in a capitalistic society destroys the meaning of whatever you're trying to represent. In cyberspace, however, the hyperrealist aspect to it actually describes the space itself. Because the space isn't real, it's more real than real. We are immersed, we exist in these spaces as if it was a real physical space, because our brain, right, the meat in our head, does not reinvent itself to process these places. We treat most digital spaces the exact same way we would a physical space. The same neural pathways involved in navigating and organizing those spaces in real life apply to cyberspace. Obviously, it's not exactly the same. There's some like muscular feedback missing and things like that. Um, but what that does is we begin to sort of replicate behaviors we have in real life in these digital spaces. So, for example, I'll show you some hyperrealism in motion. We've got Cuchulainn here from the Ulster cycle. I have a painting, classical painting from Leyendecker. It's very nice, but again, that itself is a hyperrealistic depiction. As we sort of get to the digital age, though, we sort of completely lose any semblance of the original meaning. So, there's an anime character here. There's a thing from Final Fantasy 12. I'm not sure what's going on with that, other than the fact it's called Cuchulainn. We do have attempts to recreate sort of Irishness or, call back to the sort of cultural motifs that, may or may not exist, or what we think should be Irish. Um, But in all these cases, we are creating sort of artifactual traces and archaeological value in these digital spaces. That is called the procession of the simulacra, where you have these sort of inauthentic, hyperreal entities that are representing different ideas that don't necessarily connect to the original. But what they do for us as consumers of them, we replace the original with that. We think the hyperreal entities are more real than real, so to speak. And a great example of this strictly in digital space is digital twinning. That is simply when you have a virtual representation of a real thing. For example, Singapore has digitally twinned the entire city for various purposes like traffic management. Here I've got an example. I've got St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. I have a Minecraft version of it. The Minecraft version is not St. Patrick's Cathedral, but to those that experience that hyperreal version of it, it is. And it acts in a similar manner. You can walk around it in the game. It can be treated the same way. I also have an arrow going back and forward to both here because I could technically take that hyperreal copy of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Minecraft and then recreate it in real life with Lego or craft materials or something like that. And what that's doing is creating this sort of complex network of intertextuality between the hyperreal copies of things we have. So, for example, I've got concept art from a game here on the left. I have the recreation of that concept art in Minecraft again. And the one on the right relies on the one on the left to exist. It is its own thing, it's its own sort of simulated interactive space, but it requires the context of the concept art. But what it is doing is it's creating copies of itself. And as an archaeologist, what I'm seeing here is various sort of artifactual remnants of a specific culture surrounding, for example, Bloodborne, creating its own, quote unquote, material culture to express that community. So that got me thinking about our current ontological experience, which is how we experience existence, um, or just the simple state of being. I read the thing by Haraway called Cyborg Ontology. She was writing within a feminist framework, but it has been applied to other things. Essentially, the idea is that we are physical beings as much as we are digital beings. We exist in the physical world, but we also exist online through avatars, through accounts, um, and just the way we communicate with other people. What that does is it gives you a different experience of existence, right? Because, 13th century peasant, for example, is not going to have, a Discord account or is going to play Minecraft, right? It's a completely different thing. And the fact that the sort of that we exist in both of these realms at once, and the fact that it's so ubiquitous amongst most people is giving rise to a sort of archaeological phenomenon in digital space itself, independent of the physical world, so to speak. So we have these very complex networks between people, machines, and other people in the communities and the worlds they're in that all sort of converge together to create this concept of now archaeology. The past and the present converges to create a sort of confluence of archaeological experiences and value, heritage value in different cultures that exist within the digital sphere. So for an example for this, we can look at cyborgs and their spaces. This one here on the left is from Minecraft. A player's wife passed away, and part of his grieving process was to create this cenotaph for her. Now, although the space isn't real, the behaviors and emotions we feel in it are. This guy chose to express his grief through building a monument. And to me, that is no different than, our ancestors, burying someone and practicing their burial rituals to process that grief. Cyborgs live in these sort of digital spaces. These spaces themselves facilitate those meaningful relationships between the human, the machine, and the human. And this picture on the left is a great example of that. This cenotaph is archaeological valuable? It is an artifact in and of itself. Obviously, if it's devoid of context, it loses a bit of its value. But within the context of what it is and what it represents, I think it should be investigated just like any other archaeological site. Now, don't try not to laugh. Archaeologists love material culture. It's one of the foundations of our discipline. And obviously, if you're sitting there thinking, right, this guy's saying these spaces aren't real, so how can they have material culture? Right? It doesn't make any sense. How can it be archaeological if you don't have any traces of the culture? I present to you memes. These are one example, and I think they're great because they are ubiquitous across much of the internet and cyberspace. I've chosen the troll face as an example. I could have picked anything here, though. So, for example, the first troll face, 2009, was originally made. It gained popularity in 2010. It just, it exploded across the internet. It was extremely viral. We have an evolution of that in the quote unquote schizo troll face between 2016 and 2019. It's kind of hard to pin that one down. But that represents an evolution in the sort of cultural zeitgeist surrounding humor on the internet at the time. And again, we have a final evolution of that with Trollg in 2020 and beyond, sort of post-COVID cultural zeitgeist. Again, humor evolves, the artifact changes. And obviously, we are viewing these out of context. There's a lot more to it than that. These are just three silly little pictures on a screen. But is this really any different from having an assemblage of pottery sherds on your desk and looking at them? To me, it's not. To me, this is the material trace in cyberspace. It is part of our contemporary archaeological record because it represents who we are through humor. Um, there are other examples, of course. So, for example, like Louise's game would be an archaeological artifact that could be examined, whether that be the code, the space itself, or the community that would sort of come about around her game. Um, so, what we're getting here is the sort of contemporary phenomenon of um, archaeology in digital spaces. Whether that archaeology is a silly meme like this or is a recreation of a real life site, monument, whatever it may be, even if it's something entirely new, it is happening. And approaches like cyber archaeology, whilst amazing and great, are very much how can we use the digital to look at the physical? We are sort of almost limiting ourselves from exploring the other half of the story, so to speak. So we should be careful in our approach to digital archaeology. We shouldn't disregard cultural traces we have in cyberspace just because we think they're, quote unquote, not important or not valuable. They mean things to people. Our behaviors are the same in these spaces. They have value to people just as much as, a physical place could mean someone or something to someone. Um, so, you know, cyberspace is archaeological nature, of course. I've explained that. And what's important for us is that our archaeological record is both physical and digital. We need to look at ways to preserve our digital record alongside our physical for future generations to come along. Because whilst it might not be important to us as we experience that culture contemporarily, 200 years down the line, it might be important to archaeologists then. But yeah, that is me. That's all I have. Thank you for listening.